Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franca Tamaris and I'm the Events Coordinator at the Melbourne Energy Institute. Thank you all for joining us today for AEMO's Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report for the period January to March 2023 with Mr. Kevin Lai, Group Manager for Reform Development and Insights at AEMO. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we're gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung people, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We'll also invite you to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are listening. A bit of housekeeping from this online event. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box as a chat function is disabled. We will take some breaks through the session to field questions in both the room and online, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Now to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Kevin Lai is an engineer by training with a career of more than 20 years in the energy sector in Australia. His role at AEMO covers many aspects of energy markets, including market design, policy and regulations, and he is responsible for the development and publication of the Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report, which we will be discussing today. Today's moderator is Professor Pierluigi Mancarella, Program Leader for Energy Systems at the Melbourne Energy Institute, and he's the Chair Professor of Electrical Power Systems at the University of Melbourne. We welcome them both today. I would now like to hand over to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Franca, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the quarterly energy dynamics for Q1 2023. So let's highlight some of the key findings from the quarter. We saw operational demand falling across the NEM, and there's some statistics later that highlight that. Distributed PV has increased in its quarterly average output quite significantly from COVID periods. That's good to see. Wholesale energy prices have tapered off from the last couple of quarters, and there's a number of reasons for that observation, which we'll get into. We continue to see the price separation between the southern and northern states, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And increased renewable generation is offset by decreased thermal generation. There's a bit of increased VRE curtailment, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that decrease. In terms of gas markets, we've seen the gas prices declined from the last couple of quarters. Still quite high, sitting around the $10 per gigajoule, but they have declined compared to the last couple of quarters. Gas demand for Q1 was relatively low compared to other previous Q1s. And we noticed some production issues in the QC LNG terminal, which is a key factor in that lower gas demand. And Iona Underground Storage, which is a really important storage facility in Victoria, that has been filled up to its maximum capacity for Q1. So let's get into some of the observations. As I mentioned in the summary, we've seen operational demand as shown by this pink line. That's reached a low of 21,000 megawatts, which is just slightly lower than the figure that was last seen in 2005. So that's quite a record. But underlying demand is still quite high. So the difference is the distributed PV, which added 2,900 megawatts in Q1 this year compared to Q1 in 2022. This figure to the right is the minimum demand. So you can see clearly that the trend across all 4 regions is declining minimum demand. In fact, South Australia, we saw the average minimum demand sitting at about 100 megawatts, which is quite low when the South Australian average demand sits around about the 2,000 megawatt level. But that's across the board, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria. The trend is very clear. In terms of prices across the NEM, just a couple of observations. So the solid bars are the energy price. So prices below $300 per megawatt hour, and $300 is the threshold. Well, it's not a threshold, but in the electricity market, we've got $300 strike price cap contracts, which kind of like denotes volatility. So you can differentiate anything below 300 as just energy prices, and anything above could signal volatility. So let's just focus on Queensland. So for the latest quarter, the energy component was about $92, and the volatility component was about $10 per megawatt hour. So that's come down quite a fair bit compared to quarter 1 in 2022, and that's a couple quarters after the market suspension that we had back in June last year, where you can see the energy component was $103 and the volatility component was about $50, which signaled massive volatility. So that's come down across the board, across the 5 NEM regions. So when you look at the daytime average prices, you can clearly see a trend where for Victoria and South Australia, as denoted from this orange and blue line, during the middle of the day, from about 10 a.m. to about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, you are getting, in fact, average prices for those 2 regions. So you get this very noticeable duck curve, in particular for South Australia and for Victoria. In terms of interregional flows, what we did notice was that in this quarter, last quarter, there was a general trend of flows going south. So in general, there were flows coming south from Queensland to New South Wales, and conversely from Victoria into Tassie. There was a little bit of flow going from Victoria to New South Wales, and that probably, if you correlate the prices that we talked about earlier, where Victorian prices were quite low relative to the northern region prices, that's not surprising to see the interregional flows follow that direction of the spot prices. Counterprice flows did increase, as shown by this right-hand curve. So when we compare counterprice flows in quarter 1 2022 compared to quarter 1 2023, there is a increase in the percentage of times where you are getting counterprice flows. I'll go into a bit more detail as to why counterprice flows are a feature, and it's to do with the strength of the transmission network. The Victoria-New South Wales interconnector does bind quite often. So you can see here that roughly 70% of the time, this interconnector does bind. So it just shows that transmission is really important because it facilitates trade between regions. In terms of coal-fired generation, what we've noticed this last quarter is a shift in the offered prices for thermal generation. So the easy way of looking at this is if you just draw a straight line from 10,000 megawatts straight up, you can see that in the Q1 2023 curve, you have 10,000 megawatts offered at prices of about $70 per megawatt hour. Compared that to Q1 for 2022, you had 10,000 megawatts offered at $150 per megawatt hour. So there's a couple of reasons for this. We're not exactly sure, but you can point to the government's imposed cap on the thermal prices, so that may have an influence. That thermal cap price is at $120 per tonne, and there's legislation in place in Queensland, New South Wales to incentivise black coal generators to comply with that cap. So this curve to the right is the marginal offers, and the marginal offers of black coal generation. So when we say black coal generation, we're saying Eraring, Gladstone, Vales Point, Bayswater, Tarong and Stanwell power stations. So you can see that the marginal offers did reach a peak of about $160 per megawatt hour after the market suspension in June last year, and that's tapered off over the last 12 months to an observation of around $70 per megawatt hour for the latest quarter. Yeah, this is a really interesting chart. Quite a busy chart, but let's just focus on one time interval. So if you just focus on 12 p.m. So this is Q1 2022 and Q1 2023. So if you draw a straight line up from the 12 p.m. interval, what you notice is compared to last Q1 last year, black and brown coal generators were setting the price more often compared to last quarter. And in this quarter, for that particular 12 p.m. interval, you have wind and solar setting the marginal price. So this is not inconsistent with some of the trends that we saw earlier, which is increased VRE generation. And the other interesting observation is that during nighttime, when you don't have solar generation, you don't have distributed PV, you might have wind, but then the dispatchable generation sources come into their own, and then you see hydro generators being the marginal price setter for the evening peak periods. That makes intuitive sense when I mention those factors, and also makes sense when you think about the fact that hydro generators, in particular the ones with storage, they've got an opportunity cost. Only have a finite amount of water, and they look to generate in periods where there is the highest value. Now, this curve in the right is the incidence of negative daytime prices. So I mentioned earlier, in the daytime periods for Victoria and South Australia, we are seeing high incidence of negative prices. And this clearly depicts that. So Q1 2022, you had up to about 40% occurrence of negative prices, and that's stepped up to about 70% for Q1 this latest year. The sunrise diagram just shows the changing generation supply mix. So not surprisingly, brown coal, you're seeing a drop year on year output from brown coal. You're seeing a drop quite significantly for black coal and for gas and hydro generation. And then making up that difference in output, you're seeing some increases in wind outside the daytime periods. You're seeing solar, both utility scale and distributed PV generation increase quite significantly. So this curve, I think, over time will become more peaky. I'm sure we looked at this a couple of years ago. It would have been flatter, but this is quite pronounced, and the trend, I think, will continue. So this chart on the right just breaks that down a bit more. So year on year for Q1, you're seeing distributed PV increase by 555 megawatts. Utility scale solar increased by 330, and wind by 134 on average. And the drop in output is made up of black coal, brown coal, gas, and hydro. So it's just another way of showing the changes. In terms of black coal and brown coal output, this top curve is the availability for black coal, and this bottom curve is the actual output for black coal. So what you notice is that the utilization or capacity factor is lower for black coal compared to brown coal. So brown coal, the solid line is the availability, and the lighter line is the actual output. So that's not surprising. And there's a curve later that shows black coal being more flexible, does flex their output during the day, whereas brown coal, just the type of plant, tends to want to run more flat out, and the cost curve of brown coal is also much lower on a short run marginal basis, and hence, they can afford to stay on. So these results are not surprising. So what you do notice is that in terms of absolute output, the trend is clear over the last 4 years, with black coal trending down, not as pronounced as brown coal. It's remaining fairly flat. But yeah, those are quite obvious observations. Now, this curve in the right just shows the observation of planned and unplanned outages. So let's just focus on black coal generation. So Q1 this year, there were roughly about 800 megawatts of planned generation outages, and roughly about 300 megawatts of unplanned. That's a better performance in terms of unplanned compared to what happened in the corresponding period 1 year ago, when there was quite a large amount of black coal generation out due to numerous reasons. And that was partly caused the very high prices that we saw about 12 months ago, just after the market suspension. With black coal generation in Queensland, unplanned outages were relatively high compared to those of the New South Wales counterparts. But there's swings and roundabouts. These things are unpredictable. That's why they're called unplanned outages. So this is just an observation, a point in time, and this trend may flip around next quarter. This is the last curve before it stopped for Q&A, but really interesting curve. Clearly shows the duck curve, which I mentioned. So for black coal generation, this is the average intraday profile. And what you clearly notice is that this solid red line is the Q1 2023 curve. Compare that to, for instance, Q1 2020 curve. You can see there that black coal generation didn't really have this major dip during the middle of the day, but over time, over 4 years, there's a hollowing out of the daytime output, and that's consistent with what we saw earlier, which is wind and solar taking up that generation during the middle of the day. So this has implications for black coal, which I mentioned earlier, which is the ability to cycle because they're inherently more flexible. But it does have implications for wear and tear. We don't know exactly what the consequences of this increased cycling and this wear and tear will have in terms of their performance, in terms of reliability in future years. Brown coal variability isn't as pronounced as black coal, but you still see a very noticeable duck curve type feature when you compare it to 4 years ago. And when you take a look at this black coal swing, it's a massive swing of around about 4,200 megawatts from a low to a high. So traditionally, these plants were meant to be fairly stable. So once again, time will tell in terms of what impact this operational regime may have in terms of their reliability and output and forced outage rates for future years. I'll stop there and take any questions.
Yeah, great. So I think they should hear me also online now. Thanks, Kevin. That's super interesting as always. Is there any question from the audience? Gentleman here, please.
In your predictions that you did of like a year ago, how does that line up? Has it been very accurate in your predictions?
We don't predict. It's observations. It's trends that we've seen over the quarter.
Yeah,
and then
you had to have done a year ago, done like predictions of where you think it's going to go. No. It's trends, and then we have qualitative commentary around what may or may not happen in the future. Just like I mentioned about, what's the impact of intraday swings, but we've been deliberate in terms of the quarterly energy dynamics to be factual. It's not a modeling exercise. it's not statistically based in terms of this. If you extrapolate, this may be the future. It becomes very thorny when you start to do predictions.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Please.
I think a few days ago, David Leach had a very good article where he reported the blockages between states, especially New South Wales to Victoria and Queensland to New South Wales. Would that, and he suggested the federal government needs to invest quite a bit of money to improve that. That's probably sensibly right. Would that have a significant effect on if that occurred? I'm really just sort of probably agreeing with David and asking you if you agree with what David wrote.
I haven't read his article, but in general, we are seeing that if there was more, efficient transmission, this would help. The cheapest form of energy get to load centers. That's a fact of life. That would increase the utilization of this very cheap, short and marginal cost fuel, and therefore should increase competition because you get more supply coming into a demand center.
Good article.
Okay, I'll read it.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions from online. Sure. There is you touched on this. Can you draw a link between the increased black coal unplanned outages and the increased generation variability?
Yeah, look, I don't think you can do a direct causal link. So the variability of the brown and black coal generation is exogenous. They're forced to do that because their short or marginal costs sits above that of solar and wind, and therefore when you stack the offer in the bid stack, they don't clear, and therefore they either have to come off entirely or they cycle their plant. There's problems with coming off because if you're a thermal black coal generator and your boilers aren't hot, then it can take you a couple of days just to run up your plant so that it's operational. And it's not something they want to do lightly too, because the startup sequence for thermal generation is very complex. It's thermodynamic activity, involves a lot of running machines, a lot of controls, and hence where they can cycle and flex their generation, it's probably more economic for them to do that rather than just come off and then come back on.
Yeah. So just to, there is a very interesting follow-up. You mentioned thermodynamics. We have a question from an expert actually in this kind of plants. So how much of the swing in black or brown coal generators is done by bleeding high pressure steam as opposed to ramping up and down the coal feed rate? That's a very good one.
I'm an electrical engineer, but I have to admit I haven't done engineering in the pure sense for about 20 years now. That's getting into the realms of boiler engineering. Look, the black coal plants do have some levers. I mean, if you take a look at the pulverizing mills, some of them will have like 6 pulverizers. So, if they want to cycle, they just switch off the number of mills. They've got bypass valves on the turbines, which they can utilize. But my memory is every time they do that, there's a drop in thermal efficiency, and they're kind of like burning fuel and not getting output. So there's an efficiency aspect here, which is not ideal. So it's not something that they would do lightly.
Yeah, I guess, and thanks, Robin, for the question. Where that's, I guess that's the idea. I'll try to understand. Probably it comes at a loss of efficiency, but probably there's not so much wear and tear, and therefore, the plant manager, I guess, will make these tough decisions overall.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but no, that's very interesting. Thanks again for the question. So next question is about the role of gas. Especially in terms of like setting the price in the market around like 8 p.m. time frame, which is like a peaking aspects. Or is this because of the higher price for gas? I mean, I think in one of your slides, basically you see that gas is no longer the kind of peaking plant and setting the price there. So is it because of high gas prices, or is there anything else there?
This is just rough rule of thumb. Like the gas price averaged about $10 per gigajoule, and the heat rate for typical gas turbine, open cycle gas turbine, might be about 9 to 12. And if you multiply the two together, the short run marginal for gas plant is probably sitting around the $120 mark, 120 to maybe 150. So that's quite high. So that's why if there's other fuels like hydro or wind, or the black coal generation, which is has a short run marginal probably sitting around the $30 to $40 megawatt hour mark, they are just naturally more competitive. So hence, if you've got high gas prices, which they're relatively high, you don't expect gas generation to be the marginal price setter.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at, it's probably slide 8. It clearly shows this kind of behavior. So yeah, that's great. No, but thanks for the question and for the answer, Kevin. So last, is there any other question from here? Okay, so there's one more question online. Well, thank you for the insightful presentation. Everyone agrees on this. Do you have any figure showing low power variation of coal fleets over the years for black and brown? I'm not sure what low power variation means. But do you have like probably just show, if you look at brown coal and black coal over the years and how much they've been
Yeah,
varying?
I think they might be talking about capacity factor. So we had a curve earlier which showed that brown coal generation, typically capacity factor is quite high. So in other words, whatever the availability is, they tend to generate pretty much up to that availability. Whereas black coal generation, we're seeing wider divergence where the availability is still high, but the output is relatively lower, and therefore your capacity factor for black coal generation decreases. And that's consistent with the observation that we saw where black coal generation has those swings and roundabouts. We mentioned 4,200 megawatts of intraday swing between the low and the high, and hence when you do the maths, the capacity factor for black thermal generation would decrease over time.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's yeah. Thank you. Just maybe a question for me, I guess is like probably clarification for me. You mentioned the counter price flows, that they're increasing, and then we just that has the importance of actually having proper network. Can you elaborate on what the counter price flow is? Because maybe not.
Yeah,
so not be familiar with that. Yeah,
we've got a slide on the counter price flows, so yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah,
and then we can come back at the end of the presentation.
Awesome. Let's do excellent. Let's do that then. Yeah, maybe we can start again then. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay. Now, in terms of wind and solar output, this shows how much energy was spilled, and there's a couple of factors for spilling. Spilling is when it's similar to the capacity factor of your thermal plants. Like the wind and solar might have a availability of 100 megawatts, but on average they might be generating 70 megawatts. So what's the reason for that 30 megawatts of non-generation? So in the northern regions, New South Wales and Queensland, we don't see much spillage. So the change from quarter 1 this year to quarter 1 last year, there's increase in VRE generation of about 350 megawatts, and curtailment wise, those northern generators only choose not to generate because maybe the spot price is low for about 30 megawatts. This other blue chart is offloading due to actual network constraints. So there could have been a system strength issue, there could have been a thermal constraint issue, which required those generators located in the area to back off to meet system security requirements. So not much curtailment or offloading for northern states. But then you look at southern states. So overall, compared to last year, there's increase of 150 megawatt of generation. There's some technical curtailment due to system security requirements, as denoted by this green color chart. But what you notice is that there's quite a lot of curtailment, which is economic curtailment or offloading. So these generators choose not to generate. And going back to my earlier slide, you had quite a lot of periods in the middle of the day for Victoria and South Australia where you have negative prices. So think about it. Negative prices means generators have to pay the system operator to generate. So these variable renewable plant, and you can look at the LGC price, because the LGC price is about maybe $50. So they will earn that for each megawatt of output. So they take that into account, and all else being equal, if the spot price was below $50, there's no sense for them to generate because they're paying the system operator for the privilege of providing energy. So therefore, the southern states in particular, where there's high incidence of negative prices, choose not to generate. And that's why you have a high amount of offloading. And this chart to the right is just a bit more detail. So I mentioned the network security constraints. So you can see that there are some instances where for system security, AEMO is required to set up constraint equations in such a way that if there's at certain times, if the constraints bind and there's too much solar or wind generation, then to maintain security, those plants would automatically be backed off. So it does occur, but not too much compared to the offloading, but that's the statistics around how much is curtailed for network security reasons. For instance, Victoria, you had on average about 11 megawatts of grid solar curtailed for security reasons, and you had about 4 megawatts curtailed from the wind sector. So this just drills down an extra level of detail in terms of, if you take a look at the renewable energy zones, which areas are most affected by this curtailment, this network-related curtailment. So you can see here for Victoria,
Okay, it's the northwest Victoria, or the Murray River zone, which gets curtailed the most. So when you look at Q1 2023, about 30 megawatts on average is curtailed due to network limitations, compared to 20 megawatts the previous year. And the reason for that, just in layman terms, is there's weak transmission network that joins the New South Wales to Victoria region, and this is like a relatively weak 220 network, 220 megawatt transmission network lines. So when you have a lot of VRE generation in southwest New South Wales, when prices in New South Wales are relatively high compared to Victoria, then they've got an incentive to generate more. And at times they might bid in such a way that forces generation that's counterprice flows to Victoria. But the root cause of this behavior, the root cause of this is the weak transmission system, that 220 megawatt system that I mentioned, which forms part of the Victoria and New South Wales interconnection between Victoria and New South Wales. So that's the limitation. That limitation means not as much Victorian generation can be exported to the northern regions, even though the price in the northern regions is higher. And then when you take a look at New South Wales, the zone that gets backed off for curtailment is the southwest New South Wales region. In terms of instantaneous PV output, the trend is very clear. So distributed PV, you can see that since 2018, it's gone from 4,000 megawatts to now 12,000 megawatts. So distributed PV is your mums and dads commercial distributed rooftop PV. Wind has steadily increased over time, and grid solar is also on a very high trajectory since 2018. In terms of emissions, it's not surprising. If you have more VRE generation, then you would expect the emission intensity for the electricity sector to drop, and that's exactly the trend that we're seeing. So 2022, it's sitting around about 0.9 tonne per megawatt hour, and that's dropped to 0.58 tonne per megawatt hour. Now I've got a few slides on gas. So this is the East Coast gas prices. They are still high. So they're sitting around the $10 per gigajoule mark for the quarter. Thankfully this trend is going down compared to where it was sitting at around the $40 per gigajoule mark about 12 months ago. And in fact, the gas markets were suspended in the NEM along with the electricity markets back in June last year. This top curve is the ACCC netback pricing. So thankfully, the netback price didn't directly translate to the domestic price. Had it translated, we would have had $60 per gigajoule prices, which I'm sure Victorian customers would not like. Yeah, there's a number of factors for that. The European winter was not as severe as what people had anticipated.
and a couple other observations, which I'll go through later, about the QC liquefied natural gas output, reducing the demand for gas, which helped that divergence between the ACCC netback and the actual prices. So when you take a look at the declared wholesale gas market, we're seeing more lower price offers, as denoted by this change, where if you take a look at last quarter, you had roughly 50% of offers. For instance, in December, 60% of offers in the $20 to $50 per gigajoule bracket, and in the last month of last quarter, there's only 30% of offers in that price band. So that's good to see. That's a function of increased supply and reduce domestic demand for gas. So I mentioned the Curtis Island LNG. It's had the lowest Q1 output since 2018, and that's because if you look at it sharply, QC LNG, they had an outage for most of Q1, which impacted the demand for gas, because they couldn't liquefy and process that gas at the Gateston terminal for export. Also, Infotech Civic Pivot, the Gibson Island plant, unfortunately went out of business, and that's the majority of this 2 gigajoule decrease in C&I demand. The bulk of this is the Queensland QC LNG lower demand. So when you compare overall demand, it's 397 gigajoules compared to 438 gigajoules for the East Coast gas markets. Last slide, I believe, for Q&A. So yeah, just a different way of depicting what I just mentioned a couple of slides ago. Queensland domestic supply has increased, and when you look at Queensland domestic supply, sitting at 20 gigajoules compared to only about 14 gigajoules from the corresponding period last year. In terms of Vic exports, the trend is reverse. Longford gas facility is not generating as much gas output. It typically would generate about 800 gigajoules per day, but what we've noticed is its output's only being about 700 TJs per day, and that's a big factor in why we're seeing reduced Vic exports into New South Wales and South Australia. With the increased supply from Queensland, that supply has made its way south to help the Iona storage fill up. So you can see this solid red line is 2023. So it started the quarter at 18 PJs, and it's filled up all the way to 24 PJs, which is the capacity of that storage facility. That's good to see, because that's a really important storage facility for Victoria. It's used to pick up the swings and roundabouts in demand for the Victorian gas system. That's the end of my presentation. So happy to take any other additional questions.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again, Kerry. Just fascinating. Questions from here?
Kevin, you said you were going to go back to the counter price flow.
Yeah, had one slide there where I mentioned the weak 220 kV system. So when you have lots of generation in southwest New South Wales and you have a weak system, it means that the export limit drops, and then you have the counter side where you got lots of generation in that area, and they're all trying to generate to a lower limit, and hence they bid low. And when they bid low, it sometimes causes counter price flows to Victoria. So yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Yeah, always incredible to see how the physics interacts with economics in this case. Other points? So let's follow up maybe a couple of questions online. One is about the minimal pressure demand, actually. So what's the role of demand management in dealing with the current reduced demand for thermal generation around the middle of the day?
Look, there's a really big role for demand management. So, you know, when you think about it, it's probably got no, well, it's got an opportunity cost, but it's got no short-term marginal costs. So, yeah, there's a massive role for it. There's a couple of mechanisms that they can participate. They can become a schedule load, whereby they can actually put in a bid to say, at this particular price, I'm happy to come off because, you know, it's costing me too much to buy from the spot market. So they can do that. There's a wholesale demand mechanism where, you know, if they're a large load, they can have a counterfactual demand output. And when there's high prices, they can nominate to reduce the output. And then, you know, the actual output is compared against the counterfactual baseline. And that difference is then paid at the prevailing spot price. And therefore they get to keep that as revenue. So there's a couple of mechanisms, and of course, retailers are always active in coming up with arrangements, contractual arrangements with demand response, because these retailers have large portfolios and they're looking at their hedging, and if they can reduce their exposure to high spot prices by encouraging the demand side to respond and therefore lower demand, that helps with their spot exposure. So therefore they have every incentive to negotiate demand side management type arrangements.
So I was just thinking, you know, linking to the issue of the minimum demand. I mean, some of these tools could be extended, right, to, for example, increase demand if it was needed. Is there anything being done, as far as you know, in this respect, to deal a little bit with the kind of issues during the day? Is there anything like being done or being planned somehow?
Yeah, demand management to decrease demand is a bit different to demand management to increase demand. Yeah. You know, conceptually, it would be nice, because when you got surplus VRE generation, then ideally you want load or demand to soak up the energy. And that's what a battery does. A battery is a storage device. So batteries can then soak up that excess demand, store it, and then see an opportunity to arbitrage when prices are higher. We haven't seen a market develop outside of utility scale batteries to absorb excess generation. That's not to say it won't happen, because, you know, you've got incentives for electric vehicles, and electric vehicle is another form of storage. So I think things are happening on the distribution front, but it will take time for the regulations and the policy to catch up. And technology needs to also enable that to happen, because, you know, you want the mums and dads with an electric vehicle, with a battery system and a distributed PV. You want the experience to be seamless, so almost they don't have to think about the choices they make. It's just optimized according to what happens with the wholesale market. But of course, things like the consumer protections need to be considered. You know, our mums and dads, sophisticated players. In other words, you've got a spot market that can go from negative $1,000 to $15,000 per megawatt hour. So if they take exposure, it's a double-sided, it's a double-sided sword. You know, in theory, if they're short and they have to buy the energy at $15,000 megawatt hour, that's a lot of money.
We've seen it in Texas. It happened in Texas a couple of years ago.
Yes. So that's why I say consumer protections also needs to come to the fore, because mums and dads are not necessarily sophisticated players with risk management in place to protect against upside risks. You can't just look at it from an opportunity perspective.
Yeah, no, and yeah, fully agree. For what I know, there are some trials for community batteries, for example, to have community battery tariffs that somehow would reflect the very low price that might happen during the day. So this idea of sucking energy during the day. But and this is a comment question from the audience. Unfortunately, most of network tariffs actually have been designed to be like high tariffs during the day and low tariffs during the night. Back to the old times. They haven't really been updated effectively. So there is lots of work in terms of coordination between wholesale market and network pricing, effectively, especially distribution network to make this happen with the demand management.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, definitely lots of work. Thanks for the comment.
Luigi, you got a question?
Please.
Just one question about the storage, because we talked about storage. Do you think hydrogen would be one of the main of storage in the future?
Look, there's huge potential in hydrogen. But I think the magic figure is either $2 per kilogram or $1 per kilogram. I think it's more like $1 per kilogram. That's when it becomes competitive with displacing existing energy sources. So currently, commercially, I don't know the numbers, but I believe commercially it can be produced at like $5 per kilogram. So there's a technology cost curve trajectory that it needs to come down to for it to be commercially competitive. And the US are throwing tons of money. The Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden's got $500 billion US of incentives, and part of that incentive is to encourage multinationals to come into the US and develop manufacturing and technology to bring down the cost of hydrogen. I think the federal budget had earmarked like $2 billion for research and development in green hydrogen. So it could happen in the future, but once again, requires a combination of technology and uptake so that it becomes commercially viable.
There's another question related to the operation of coal fleets, I guess, but more general. It's about the DAC curves becoming steeper and steeper. When do we hit limits? Are we going to hit like any limits, and what are these limits and when potentially?
Our CEO Daniel Westman, has mentioned the 100% renewables instantaneous penetration by 2025. So that's absolutely plausible because this quarter we saw 65% instantaneous penetration across the NEM. So for that half hour, 65% of output was supplied by VRE generation, which is massive. So you can see, over 3 years, you could in fact reach that 100% penetration. So AEMO's got a whole engineering program. It's called the engineering framework, which looks at considerations that we collectively as an ecosystem need to think about to prepare for a system where it's 100% renewable penetrations. And we talk half hour, but what happens if it's 1 hour or 2 hours? Conversely, what happens if you get a wind or solar drought for a period of 2-3 days? So you've got the opposite problem. So the engineering framework is about the preconditions that we need to satisfy ourselves that we can operate the system securely under a range of operational conditions, one of which is 100% instantaneous, but also the converse, which is you need the dispatchable generation for those prolonged periods.
Yeah, and there was maybe last year or 2 years ago an event in California where effectively, if you looked at the net demand and then the actual operational demand, there was a mismatch between both the ramps and the kind of peak time, and then eventually they needed to shed some load because effectively the system could not follow it. So
yeah,
I guess these are the limits that we don't want to hit. So the engineering framework is looking after, fortunately. So yeah, hopefully we won't be there. I'm pretty sure actually. Is there any other question here? Then maybe I can ask you the last question. It's a little bit provocative. You did not mention frequency control ancillary services, that. Is it all like solved? Is it now becoming boring to talk about FCAS markets, or what's happening there?
Oh, it's never boring to talk about markets. There's 8 FCAS markets, and soon there'll be 2 more FCAS markets. There's a fast frequency response, which encourages response in the 1 second mark, and that will help with things like rate of change of frequency, and should help with like synthetic inertia, just to maintain the steady state of the system. And that's an additional source of revenue for technologies that can respond in that 1 second period, and that will complement the existing 8 FCAS markets. So I wouldn't say FCAS markets are forgotten. They're definitely really important. Maintaining frequency within the normal operating band is really important to ensure that the system can recover when there's a frequency disturbance. And we've been lucky that the system's been quite resilient. So yeah, that's that FCAS market fast frequency response is due to come into play in October this year.
Yeah.
And the demand for that new market would ramp up over time. I think AEMO is starting off with certain requirement, and then as we learn how that market operates, that requirement should be ramped up.
Yeah. Is it both raise and lower that we
Yes.
have 2 directions?
Raise and lower.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Are we going to see like an inertia market the next maybe couple of years? I know that there are discussions that's coming next probably.
Yeah, it's a live discussion with inertial markets. So look, I think with inertia, there's a couple of challenges. Inertia is not like frequency where it's global. So frequency is a common feature, that's global across all regions. Inertia, you can argue, is more localized. If it's localized, then it becomes more difficult to set up markets because you've got local markets, then you don't have the pool of buyers and sellers to make sure that it's competitive. So that's one consideration for policymakers. And so it's a live issue, whether there is a rationale for inertia markets.
Yeah. No, and that's it's a complex one. It starts also impacting other services, system strength and all that. So yeah, it's again physics and economics coming together, always very interesting. So I think with this, I would like to conclude, invite everyone here thank our speaker. Thank you, Kevin. It's always great to have you here. And well, hopefully we'll come next time too. I'm sure there will be more exciting things to present.
No,
Thank you so much.
thank you for the opportunity to present. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you.